Wurm Online is a massively multiplayer online sandbox game that was officially released in 2006, and in spite of the rather dramatic title of this video, it's one that I look back on quite fondly. At the time, it was incredibly ambitious, and the forerunner to many of the most popular games today. Even today, I'd call it ambitious. It's difficult for me to really express the whole geist that is Wurm Online, but the main inspiration for me to make this video was seeing all those zoomers who act like empty Half-Life maps are dismally unsettling. Yeah, well, Wurm's got the inexorable decay of all you loved and cherished. Wurm at its core is a survival crafting game, and while that might sound passé, it's important to remember that Wurm Online was from 2006. I just want you to conceptualize that. When I first played Wurm, I was using dial-up. Every context menu took 2 seconds to load, and I didn't complain because that was normal back then. This isn't really a review, more of a rambling with a vaguely philosophical bent about what we can learn about Wurm rather than anything else. But before I can do any of that, first I've got to answer, what the heck is Wurm Online? Through the magic of remembering my password, I wake up where I last went to bed 10 years ago. This vast flat field used to be a bright, vibrant town, but it's since been abandoned. Now it's rotted away, leaving behind nothing but the paving stones. It's also infested with hostile creatures, and I'm not really equipped for combat, so it's best to move on. And I don't normally do this, but arachnophilia warning. If you're a fan of spiders, you're gonna love this one. On that note, check out this giant spider that's trying to kill me. Isn't it adorable? This game is a true sandbox. Everything you see around here was built by other players. Even these enormous roads that I've been walking on have been painstakingly assembled piece by fellow Wurmians for the benefit of everyone, and without playing it yourself, it's difficult to understand the amount of effort that has gone into making these. The terrain is as simple as it is genius. Each tile is made up of 4 corners, and each of those corners has a height value that you can increase or decrease through terraforming. You can use a shovel to remove dirt from one location, and then drop it elsewhere to increase the elevation. Do that thousands upon thousands of times, and you might approach a fraction of the amount of dirt that had to be moved to make these roads. When this server was put online 10 years ago, everything around here was an untamed wilderness, but now its back is crisscrossed by the scars of man. Even though Xanadu is 32 by 32 kilometers big, there's not many places that don't have some trace of another player. But after so long, many of the traces are just that. Almost everything can decay, but terraformed land will remain, and so all over the place you'll find these flat portions of land overgrown with trees or rotted down to the cobbles. You'll also find the wild remains of vineyards and orchards left to spread in their owner's absence. If you're paying money to maintain a settlement, you'll have drastically reduced decay on all of the buildings within its radius. It also prevents other players from building their own things nearby, but while you might know that someone is paying the upkeep to keep the lights on, when you explore these places, they almost feel even more lifeless than the ruins overrun with nature. With these sites as my guide, I made my way towards the major settlement of Glass Hollow. These are the only places in the game not built entirely by the players, and they serve as spawning points for people who haven't joined or created their own settlement yet. In case you were wondering just how big this map is, I've been walking for about 2 hours after Rip Van Winkling myself in the ruins of the old village, and I've only gotten about this far. This is just to orient myself, because if I die, I at least want to know how to get there back from a spawn point. In order to truly give you the Wurm Online experience, I've got to survive and craft in this survival crafting game. That means I've got to find some corner of this map that hasn't already been built on and also isn't complete crap. And if you want to be within an hour's walk from a spawn point, that's often wishful thinking. I consider settling on this mountaintop just for the fun of it, but then I realize that it's infested with fruit trees. Fruit trees are the devil in Wurm Online, and that's because they hardly give you any logs. In fact, they're so awful that there's almost no reason to even cut them down, but that's insidious because then when you cut down all the useful trees and leave only the fruit trees, they'll spread and fill the gaps until they're all that's left. Vast forests of fruit trees like this are sometimes an indication that someone many years ago probably deforested everything to grind wood cutting and then just let the fruit trees spread. Anyway, after running around a bit more, I finally decide what's the least appealing place to settle for anyone, and that leads me to this valley between 2 mountains with 0 natural resources. There's massive slopes everywhere that make terraforming a nightmare, and there's no water anywhere near. Perfect. I do a bit of a walk around, and all I find are some old ruins as well as this dilapidated building called a backyard, so it's probably fine. It's not like I'm gonna be staying here for long anyway. I spawned with most of my tools, but I don't have everything, and so the biggest priority for any new base is finding a source of iron. You can prospect the rocks on the surface to find if there's a vein in a 7x7 radius, and by prospecting different areas until it vanishes, you'll be able to pinpoint it. Once I know where it is, I can use a pickaxe to start tunneling into the rock face. This introduces the main element of Wurm Online, your stamina bar and your action timer. You're mainly going to be queuing up actions and then waiting for them to be completed. You can queue up multiple actions, but performing actions uses stamina, and the lower your starting stamina, the longer the action will take, so you need to stop and rest every once in a while. But after 10 minutes of doing nothing but tunneling, I've finally broken into the mountain. A little bit. I've got to go even further in if I want that iron, and there's a bit of a dilemma. There's no water around anywhere, and I'm starting to get thirsty. I had a clay pot that I used to carry water around, but I've already drank it all. If you're dehydrated, you'll regenerate next to no stamina, so this is an issue. However, I can cut down a tree, cut it into logs, and then cut some kindling from those. I can use that kindling to start a fire, and then I can throw some iron chunks I found while foraging into the fire, and after waiting several minutes, it melts into iron lumps. Then I can take those iron lumps, use them on my small anvil, and create a ball and then a chain. There's a chance to fail, by the way. Then I can attach them to get a ball and a chain, and by swinging it around, I can start to divine the location of an underground water source. I'm sure some of you have watched Josh Strife Hayes' video on Wurm Online, but I'd personally disagree that Wurm Online is complicated. It's mostly just convoluted. It's not conceptually difficult to look up on the wiki and find the two items you need to rub together to create a bucket. Oh, it's a plank and some nails, but it is less than ideal. The way that you need to select every item to use it on another item to then go down a context menu so that you can select what action to take is where Wurm really shows its wrinkles. It's from the spreadsheet era of computer games. This video isn't really about that though, so just take this sort of clunky crafting system in stride, because Wurm is so much more interesting than just its technical shortcomings. Anyway, I find a spot where I can get some water from the ground, but the only problem is it's on the side of a cliff, so I decided to deal with my thirst for now and forge on into the mine. You know how it took 10 minutes to make the entrance? Well, it's gonna take another 10 to break out another tile, and this is with a decent quality pickaxe and mining skill. If you were a beginner, this would take significantly longer. But just like that, I've found my iron vein. This will be very important, but I've got to mine on. My thirst is making waiting for my stamina to regen extremely painful, but thanks to remembering my brother's password, I was able to pilot his body to where I was while I was mining and double up the effort. Running multiple accounts at once is pretty common in this game, and the developers don't complain that much because if you want them to be useful, that just means buying premium for 2 accounts instead of 1. After much more mining, I finally uncover that tile where I divined water. And just like magic, if I take a bunch of these rock shards that I've generated while mining, I can turn them into a fountain that will automatically fill with water as long as it's on top of that tile. That'll solve all of my hydration issues, just as soon as it fills up. I'm also knocking out another little alcove to fit some smelting stuff, because now it's iron time. I mine the iron vein just like the walls, but instead of getting rocks, I get iron ores. If I throw those into the campfire, I can get iron lumps, and now with an effectively infinite supply of iron, I can make all of the tools I need. This should give you the gist of it all. It's a lot of crafting the specific things that you need to make the other things that you want, such as chopping apart these trees for logs, and then sawing them into planks to make this cart so that I can move around heavier stuff. And then making a bunch of iron ribbons so that I can make mine supports. They're a bit of a pain to make, and while not strictly necessary, they make the mine a whole lot less jagged and horrible, so they're 100% necessary as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, the point is that everything in Wurm Online takes time. Okay, I guess that's a bit of a constant of the entire universe, but you know what I mean. This all might sound hellaciously monotonous, and while I will admit that this won't appeal to everyone, it definitely has its own distinctive appeal. I talked about this in my barotrauma video, but it's far more pertinent here, so I'll reiterate it. I view time as a sort of universal currency that game designers can use to impart value into the virtual spaces. Whether it's a maxed Runescape account or master prestige in Call of Duty, I'm willing to bet that there's something in gaming that sits close to your heart purely because of how much time and effort it took to acquire. The psychological profundities of why we as humans can ascribe so much meaning to what is essentially electrons held in suspension between plates of metal is one I'm frankly not qualified to expand upon, but it seems reasonable to say that people care about video games. In fact, some people care about video games a little too much. In action games, this is usually expressed through hijacking the centers of your brain that would really prefer to reward you for acquiring useful life skills so that they instead reward you for P-ranking Ultra Kill. The appeal is a combination of curiosity to see what's next, as well as the desire for personal challenge and growth. But then there's the curious category of the commonly called cozy game. Wurm Online is definitely in the cozy category, though its spreadsheet nightmare interface probably scares off most of the casuals right at the gates. I remember back in 2010 reading forum posts about people begging them to update the interface only to get shot down by power players who said, "I like it this way." By the way, what you're looking at now is the improved UI, but I digress. I've explored this phenomenon in my video about various farming games, and my ultimate conclusion was that the cozy game formula is to constantly present the player with a series of small goals that lead seamlessly into the next, while also keeping each step of the process not quite mindless, but not exactly taxing either. Like right now, I've got to get some clay so that I can build a proper forge, but my awful location has none anywhere near, so I've got to drag my cart all the way to the ocean to get some. Yes, it might not look like it, but I assure you that I am dragging a small cart. Yes, I know this game looks janky, but this is more of a spiritual analysis than a technical one. Also, why are there so many spiders? At least someone was kind enough to build this guard tower nearby so that I can have them tank all the spider bites instead. Anyway, because it's a goal in service of another goal, this long trip doesn't feel nearly as excruciating. I'm not necessarily thinking about digging all this clay, I'm thinking about what I'm gonna use it for, and because it took me time to get, mentally, clay feels especially important or valuable. Time is the ultimate limited resource, and each of us has only got so much, so even though it's only data, I've spent all my precious time gathering it, so of course I'm gonna ascribe some kind of value to it. Obviously, this is contingent upon the game giving you some reason you would want to spend your time on it, but this is the strength of the sandbox. I'm hesitant to make grand, sweeping statements about all of humanity, but the fact that a sandbox game is the most popular video game of all time speaks to this idea that human beings have an innate desire to express themselves into their environment. Whether it's a live, laugh, love poster in your living room, or a one-to-one replica of the USS Enterprise D in Minecraft, it's all the same core tenet. Time in this case becomes the currency required to express yourself, and with this transactional mindset, whatever you build ends up containing all the value that you've poured into its constituent components. Not spending the time actually cheapens it. Looking at someone's Factorio megabase that they built in the editor, it's like, yeah, it's impressive, but not as impressive than if you'd done it normally, so even other people are sensitive to the value of your time. There was this cave I encountered on my travels, and the scale is simply incredible. To get the ceilings this high, whoever made it had to mine down hundreds of times per tile. This place was most likely used as a massive quarry to generate stone chunks for bricks, and the lowering of the floors was mostly just a side effect over potentially years of extracting resources. Just thinking about how many roads, walls, bridges, and guard towers came out of this place gives me this sense of player-driven scale that so few games can even come close to replicating. Mechanically, you could say that queuing simple action timers to achieve this effect is a bit heavy-handed, but it does communicate to the player their effectiveness as they gain skill or pick up better equipment, though more on that later. I've managed to build that forge, set up some storage, and flatten some land. My goal is to simply make a little homestead here as an example, but there's some rather ambitious builds in this game. Unfortunately, there's no tower guards around here, so I've got to kill everything myself. Fortunately, I've got a 70 quality two-handed sword someone gave me before I logged off a million years ago. Shout out to Mordo Stalin, wherever you are. The problem with this is that it leaves me with wounds, which reduces my maximum stamina. That means any action I want to do, like digging, is going to take significantly longer. The light ones heal over time, but medium wounds won't heal at all unless you apply a healing cover, which you can get from mixing together some random things you found in the grass. Except you can fail to make the cover, and once you succeed in making it once, you can still fail to apply it, causing the healing cover to explode and setting you back to square one. This is an echo of the older Wurm design, where this logic applied to basically everything. Back in the day, if you wanted to make a bed, it was common wisdom to apply the headboard to the bed frame instead of the other way around, because if you failed to create it, you'd only end up disintegrating the active item, saving you from blowing up the much more expensive bed frame. Also, pretty much every action took 12 seconds regardless of your skill. Wurm Online is still pretty brutal, but it's funny to remember that it used to be so much worse. I've also tamed these horses. You can ride them if you have over 21 body control, but it's impossible to get if you're not paying for premium. Mostly I want them for something else, though. Yeah, I should probably mention that there's about a million different skills that you'll slowly gain over time, but if you want anything respectable, you'll need to grind and grind and grind. In Wurm Online, you'll pretty much always want raw materials, and so right now I'm cutting down some logs and turning them into planks. Because I have around 50 in woodcutting, the trees I cut down will usually be around 50 quality, and that means I can make planks of up to 50 quality. Quality is in almost everything, and affects various things depending on the item. For something like planks, it increases the success rate of building with them in conjunction with your carpentry skill, but for something like a tool, it'll generally decrease the time that something like digging takes, as well as increases the chance of higher quality yields. Right now, I'm making a large cart, and even though I've got over 50 carpentry, I've only got 20 fine carpentry, so my chances of successfully attaching a plank is only around 40%. I'm not going to go into it too much, but there's some insane skill bloat in this game. And a legendary blacksmith would struggle to make a simple carving knife because it takes weaponsmithing instead of blacksmithing. By the way, a hatchet isn't considered a weapon, but a carving knife is. If I fail, it just means I need to try again, so it's effectively the same as making the timer take longer, except with the chance of being extra annoyed when you find yourself in the unlucky universe. It does make grinding for the higher skill levels more appealing, so from a game design standpoint, it's not without merit, but especially when combined with the interface, it results in even more clicks. You've heard about context-sensitive game design. Well, Wurm Online is about as context-insensitive as physically possible. Everything is context menus, and clicking on the one specific thing that lets you do the other thing is everything. The large cart can carry even more dirt, but even though it can fit 100, I've only got the body strength to drag around 80 at a time. Quick aside, I'm making 2 sets of horseshoes. Once I've got them, their quality is pretty low, so I decide to improve them. That process requires slowly applying whatever specific item the game demands and rolling for a chance to increase their quality every time you attempt it. If you fail, it gets damaged and you need to repair it, which reduces the quality a bit. For metal, you either need to hammer, polish, temper, sharpen, or use a lump. And even though I've got over 50 blacksmithing, my slave only has around 40 mining, which means that they can only mine 40 quality iron ore. The moment the horseshoe is up to that quality and asks for a lump, I can't improve it anymore because the lump needs to be higher quality than the item you're trying to improve. That means I'm stuck around 40 quality, even though with my skill I could go up as high as 60 if I had the lumps. Well, it'll make the horses a bit faster at least. And just look at this horse's equipment. I've got to expand this whole drop-down menu for every body part. And even though the front 2 hooves are just there, to get the back 2 I need to expand 4 hooves first. It appears that when they were first designing the equipment system, they basically hard-coded in human features without questioning whether they'd like to add equipment for non-humans, and then they were forced to work backwards from there. It goes 20 kilometers per hour now, which is actually pretty good considering the fastest you can walk around is 16 kilometers per hour on cobblestone. I think I've shown enough of this game to get to my general criticisms of Wurm Online, and my first major one would be this quality mechanic. I actually like it conceptually. It's something that rewards and reflects the amount of effort that you've put into your skills, which is communicated effectively through gameplay. It visibly engenders a sort of pride in your skills and equipment, and in larger groups it creates this interesting dynamic where tasks are naturally delegated towards the players who are the most adept at them. It allows you to specialize and cooperate, relying on other players to compensate for your deficiencies. It also means that the skills you enjoy the most become your strongest, and ideally causes everyone to filter into the tasks that they like most. It's a very interesting and ambitious philosophy, but it's fairly effective. It's no secret that Wurm is in its twilight years, and I think it's doing better than most MMOs from the period, but its daily average users is around 1,000. However, I'm going to be pessimistic and assume that half of those are alt accounts. In Josh's video, he mentions that improved tutorials would help player retention, and while I'll have to agree spiritually, I'd say that what's much more important is the actual beginner experience is appealing. As it stands, the newbie experience in Wurm Online is one of the worst. Fundamentally, I'd boil this down to the quality mechanic. It's an excellent reward for putting the effort in, but in rewarding the power players, it leaves everyone else mostly irrelevant. If you're starting out and want to become a blacksmith, well, with over 10 years of grinding to catch up on, to become competitive, you would need to grind for hundreds of hours to be capable of making a tool that would earn more than an expression of pained encouragement from the other players. That's fine, actually. Again, I'm not against delegation, but here's the issue. Well, you can't contribute by making high-quality tools, so what can you do? Collect raw materials for the people who have the skills, of course. It's not glamorous, but it's a way to feel helpful. Except you're wrong. If you want to make bricks without the mining skill to get high-quality shards, your bricks will all be trash. It's the same story for planks or anything you want to do. You can use them, but anything made from them would be low quality too. Houses and walls would decay much faster than if they'd just been made by a veteran who can churn out 90 quality bricks like it's nothing. They also have a lower chance of attaching successfully, which means that they waste more time compared to their higher quality counterparts. That's not to mention that someone with maxed skills could make something about 5 times as fast as you and all higher quality. So again, even at the raw resource level, there's a massive power gap. The only thing newbies can really contribute to the power players is paving things, setting up mine supports, or digging, because these are the only things that are quality agnostic. There is a use for high quality dirt, but it's mostly used for raising land elsewhere. Except, in the case of digging, the maximum slope you can dig is 3 times your digging level, so even then you'll only be able to flatten things that are already mostly flat. So, welcome to Wurm Online. Your starting job opportunities are bricklayer and dirt mover. It's no wonder it struggles to retain players. I'm not saying it's impossible to get into, I'm just saying it's not as enjoyable as it otherwise could be. But changing anything now would piss off the whales whose money keeps the lights on, so it's stuck like this. You could, of course, ignore all of that and set out on your own, living off the land and everything you make yourself. And that's not an incorrect way to play, but you'll be at a marked disadvantage if you're not using high-quality tools. I could bang out the beginnings of this settlement in the better part of a day, but that's because I've already got decent skills. It would be significantly harder as a beginner. I mean, that's what I did when I first started playing, and I had fun, but again, I'm a little more driven than most people, and it was also like 15 years ago. Also, it's important to note that without good equipment, pretty much everything in the wilderness will kill you, and then it's a 30-minute walk to get back from the starting town, plus the eventual tango with what killed you last time to try and get your stuff back. To earn fighting experience, you need to kill things, but when everything kills you instead, it's a bit of a catch-22. While I love the concept of slowly gaining skill and prominence in your craft, it ends up leaving the newer players feeling disenfranchised and aimless. There needs to be a clear pipeline from newbie to master that isn't just grind the skill for hundreds of hours. Even if you wanted to focus entirely on making things that have value despite your skill, such as iron ribbons for mine supports, the skill gains from that are insignificant compared to improving tools. In order to use your time effectively, you're stuck raising the quality of things even though no one will ever want to use them. That's not just unfun, that's depressing. Realistically, I think it's a little ridiculous that someone through apparent divine knowledge could create godly rock shards while mining the same exact rock as someone else. I like quality, but I think a compromise would be making all the raw materials quality agnostic. This would allow for many universally valuable things that anyone can understand and contribute to regardless of skill, while skill would still allow you to generate them faster or get more per action. This would encourage bot accounts and other unscrupulous activities, but having a newbie experience this bad simply because of botters would be the definition of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Anyway, after building all of this, all it's really lacking now is a house. I want it to be a respectable estate, so obviously it's got to be stone, but that means I've got to go get more clay. At least this time I don't need to drag around a small cart and can instead hitch those horses I found up to my large cart. By the way, in this game, you can automatically walk forwards by pressing X, and this auto walk is easily the best quality of life feature in the entire game, because for most of this I can just be doing something else, like writing the script. Over here you'll see a beautiful example of a player-owned settlement. One disadvantage something like Wurm Online has compared to Minecraft would be the lack of transformativeness. That is to say, in Wurm, a wall is only a wall, but in Minecraft, a carefully placed block could instead be the door to your replica of the Back to the Future DeLorean. In Wurm, your capability for expression will be limited by what the game's artists have managed to add in, making the possibilities linear rather than multiplicative. That being said, I actually think this is a good thing because it forces people's builds to fit into the game's aesthetics. Regardless, it's interesting thinking about the person who built all of this over the months, but I've got clay to dig up. Activate Turbo Boost now! By the way, while I'm doing this, I'm still puppeteering my other account to make stone bricks, but once I'm done digging like 200 times, I've got enough to build the first floor of my house. By the way, this trip takes about 10 minutes, but on the grand scale of the entire map, it's right next door. I've also got to go collect some sand, but I've only got to dig like 20 times to get enough. Back at the base, I can drop that off in the bulk storage bin and then force my puppet to start making mortar from the sand and clay. I'll need 20 per wall, and while he makes the rest of that, I can start building. I know this isn't a video about the jank, but it literally took me like 20 minutes to figure out how to actually plan the build I wanted. Now I get to slowly build this house brick by brick. Assuming an average of 15 seconds per brick, each one of these walls will take me about 5 minutes to build. Fortunately, that other account has pretty high masonry, so as soon as it's finished making mortar, I can get it to help out with some of these walls. Of course, I'm doing this all myself, but this is the kind of collaborative effort that should be encouraged mechanically. After getting all the walls up, now I've got to install the floors. But my alt account doesn't have enough paving skill to build the stone slab floors, so I'm on my own for this one. At least I could get them to make and bring the slabs to the worksite. I also want a second floor to prove that I'm not poor, and now I can build spiral staircases. I remember when multi-story buildings were just added, and they've always been janky, so I can only imagine the spaghetti code that actually makes these work. Whatever, now that I'm up here, I can start making the floor of the second story. Okay, I've suddenly decided that I want to make this a true medieval-styled house and build the second floor out of timber-framed walls instead of plain planks. But guess what that means? It means I've got to go get more clay! Hooray! I brought the puppet with me because I don't care if the clay quality sucks anymore. It's not like I'm going to mind the walls decaying, seeing as I'll be leaving as soon as I'm done anyway. Oh god, the champion spider's on us. Quit standing around and doing nothing, tower guards. I don't care if I've already called you, it's clearly right there. Well, that takes care of that, I guess. What? What is this? What is this seethe shack that someone's built here while I was gone? Okay, so apparently someone actually cared, and that one-by-one dilapidated shack that didn't even have a roof belonged to someone active in this area. It's like a passive-aggressive roommate leaving sticky notes everywhere. By the way, this giant field of nothing where the only visible build is mine and a road is what he's laying claim to. It's funny more than anything, but it does segue nicely into an issue with this sort of sandbox MMO, and that's land grabs. Clearly in this case it's a little ridiculous, but if you want to set out on your own, it's difficult to find unspoiled land. Almost all seafront property will be claimed by someone else, or at the very least bear the scars of the last person to live there. The places closest to the starting area will be filled out the most, and you'll need to go deeper and deeper to find an available place, which means a longer walk from civilization should you die. Unless, that is, you shell out for your own settlement. The Decay mechanics try to address this by making unattended structures return to the earth, but there are many things that it can't touch, like flattened land and paved ground, so it becomes extremely unappealing to settle there. That means over time, half the map ends up filled with dead builds. You can't just wipe the server and start from scratch, people's settlements are on there, so the solution is, as ever, to add more servers so that you can do the same things there as well. The last batch of servers was added in 2020, and now there's 16 different maps to repeat the cycle on, 17 if you count the tutorial island. The first come first serve aspect of this isn't the worst, but it does feel like there needs to be a better method of returning builds to some semblance of nature by smoothing excessive slopes and letting trees tear through pavement. Hell, you could go all the way. Instead of making them just disappear, make dilapidated walls and fences harvestable for free raw materials to really encourage people to tear them down. That's how it worked throughout history, after all. It would certainly assuage this haunted feeling that seems to emanate from so much of this game. Also, the decay of these massive builds isn't always a good thing, even if their creators aren't playing anymore. You have some things that are eternal, like this whole damned pyramid that someone's trying to build, but this is the exception. It seems reasonable that you would want your sandbox to show off the best of people's builds, but even the biggest, most ambitious settlement will crumble to dust and leave nothing but their ghosts as soon as the money runs out. So perhaps there should be a process of turning a player-owned settlement into a permanent fixture of the world? That way, traveling through this world would at least feel more like visiting a museum rather than an archaeological site. I mean, it's not like they have problems with just making new servers anyway. Anyway, I start working on the second floor, and as much as I'd like my puppet to help me, he doesn't have 21 carpentry, so even though he has the skill to build these walls, he's not allowed to build them on the second floor. Like, it would be nice if I could start the wall and then another player could continue it without needing the skill, but nope, I'm on my own up here as well. Whatever, I'll get him to make the shingles for the roof in the meantime. Running an alt in tandem certainly speeds things up. I'm not quite sure how to feel about it, but I like to think it's a replacement for what the game would feel like if it were still in its heyday and I had friends. There we go, all finished. Isn't it beautiful? Honestly, this concept has so much potential because it combines the masculine urge to homestead with the feminine urge to decorate. It's also quite meditative, and with games like web fishing hitting it big, there's obviously a growing demand for these low-stress, chill-out and socialize type games. I was originally going to end it here, but since that guy whined about me building in his backyard, I've got a little more I want to do. It's gonna take another 560 planks and several hours, but it's gonna be worth it. With 55 levels in carpentry, I'm capable of building houses up to 6 stories tall, and so obviously I've got to build a tall one. But I don't want it to take too many materials, so a 1x1 tower should be good enough. And to really tie this little outpost together, I'm gonna put a bell on top so that I can ring it and tell the whole world that I'm here. There, it's perfect. I hope our friend likes it. While I'm at it, I might as well cover this whole place with a settlement token. It costs like $5, but I guess that's what my patrons are for. This will let me spawn here, and it'll stop anyone else from building in its radius, so no more backyards. I have decided to call this place Bell's End Outpost, because it's got a strong and tall bell tower as its defining feature, and for absolutely no other reasons at all. So there it is, my own corner of the map that will remain as long as I remember to feed it money. However, to make something that will truly endure, there's one last thing I want to make. I'm going to build a guard tower. To do that, I've got to yet again embark upon the journey to get clay, but this time I've somehow managed to convince the 2 players that I used to play Wurm with to hop on and give me a hand, with the 4th one being another alt. And I actually love this scene of everyone riding in a cart to get to the same location to go to work. And while they're less valuable on PvE servers, they are useful as landmarks and safety for people without the combat skills. PvP servers, now there's a topic, but I'll begin with this. While I do think that building for the sake of building in Wurm Online has value, it feels like it's lacking a unifying reason to be doing anything. The player interactions and sense of community are one strength, and the fact that players naturally end up building things like markets and long underwater tunnels to connect lakes to the ocean so that boats can travel inland shows an emergent complexity that cannot be understated. But the fact of the matter is, there's not much to do apart from treating it like a tool for creative expression. In that, it's much less effective than something like Minecraft, especially with how hamstrung beginners will feel, as truly ambitious builds are locked behind months of grinding. With the available alternatives today, it's difficult to justify the effort to achieve that expression, especially when it's in a server you don't control and will eventually disappear without constant upkeep. For all of my talk of it imparting value, time is by no means the only metric, and people will happily spend their time elsewhere if they think they're getting higher returns. Wurm's persistent nature as an MMO is what sets it apart, so I'm not bashing that aspect, but for the increased scope and massively multiplayer mantle, you would expect some central motivating factor. The developers were likely thinking the same thing, and thought it was obvious that that would be PvP. The players that only wanted to build would have their safe little worlds, while all the real players could sail to chaos and play the real game. It seems obvious, suddenly all of your actions are contextualized as a struggle against a foe. Every building you make, a defense. Every guard tower you build, an expansion of your kingdom's territory. Every weapon you forge, another drop of blood from your enemies. Sadly, this never manifested in the way that they wanted. As of writing this, there are 5 players in Chaos, 27 in Defiance, and 33 on the Epic servers, while the total number of players on all servers is 819. That means only 8% of the player base is currently somewhere that allows PvP, and of those who are currently engaging in PvP, well, I'm not there to say, but that leaves less players than there are square kilometers, so you be the judge. I can share with you my experience with Wurm PvP, because I was there when they launched the Epic cluster in 2011. It was originally meant to revitalize PvP, which even back then had all but completely died in Chaos, then called Wild. It was separate from the main islands, and so everyone was forced into a fresh start. Skills gained faster, and there was a curve, meaning that if you had 50 in a skill, it would behave as if you had 70. This was an attempt to counteract the fact that to even engage in PvP meaningfully, you had to grind to at least 70 in all your combat skills, then have someone else provide you with high-tier equipment. It was split into 4 islands, 3 home islands for each of the kingdoms, and then 1 central one where most of the conflicts would occur. I started out on the home island of Mulrahan along with some friends. The intention was to increase our skills before sailing to the main server, and we decided that our main goal would be to build a boat for ourselves to get there, and the fact that you can just make a boat and sail between servers is cool on its own, but making a boat from scratch is a massive undertaking. We decided on a cog because it's fast, but this is what it takes to make one, and with our shipbuilding skills non-existent on the fresh start, we'd only have something like a 20% chance to attach each peg to it. Well, we spent weeks assembling it bit by bit, and then one day I logged on to see that someone had broken the fence and stolen the cart we'd kept it in. I used the tracking feature to find their footprints and deduced that the perpetrator had absconded somewhere to the east about 4 hours earlier. I followed it until the trail went cold, but the way that it just stopped around the side of a mountain was suspicious, so I started spam examining the rock faces, and sure enough, one was a hidden mine entrance. We bashed it open, and then lo and behold, inside was our cog amongst a horde of other ill-gotten gains. It's a fun story, and it shows the depth of features Wurm has, but if I hadn't gotten it back, I would have been out of weeks of work. That wasn't even an enemy either, that was just a griefer. Anyway, we eventually sailed to Deliverance and set up a nice little base there. It was quaint. I made guard towers to expand my kingdom's borders and set up some defensive walls. Even though I wasn't part of the major groups, I felt like I was doing something useful despite us mostly playing amongst ourselves. It was the kind of intrinsic motivation that I craved, but then I was confronted with the reality that I needed to sleep. And one day I woke up again to our mine being broken into and our boat stolen. My 60 quality boat lock and anchor was no match against someone who'd spent dozens of hours grinding lockpicking in the safety of their settlement. Weeks of effort were just gone through no fault of our own, except the selfish desire to settle somewhere that wasn't in the heart of the capital and then go to sleep. It really hit me then that this wasn't fun. The person who stole it probably didn't think too much of it either. Him and his group of hardcore friends could probably construct a new one in a single day, but to me it represented real passion and effort. No matter what you do, there's going to be this interminable power imbalance between the player who hangs around a couple hours a day and the one who is on 12 hours a day power leveling. I've also touched on this in my barotrauma video, but this experience all those years ago is what really cemented my belief that this idealized open-ended sandbox PvP is a false god. Homo homini lupus, humans are terrible opponents, because unlike computers, they don't have the other player's enjoyment at heart. They have their own interests. And if that means raiding someone else's settlement while everyone is asleep, then they'll do that because that maximizes their gains and minimizes their own risk. We actually already have an open-world sandbox game with unlimited PvP potential. It's called Real Life, and this is the same mindset that gave us the nuclear fucking bomb, so that's fun, that's fair. It's actually worse in video games because there's no risk of repercussion. I still played after that, and mostly hung around to the fringes, maintaining guard towers that the enemy tried to destroy, but I was privy to some of the happenings. There were actually player-made kingdoms you could found back then, and one of them was called the Mongol Empire. They recruited pretty much every PvP tryhard they could find, and it essentially ended up being them versus everyone else on Deliverance. This was at the height of interest in PvP, and in an almost cinematic flourish, the three separate kingdoms came together to raid the Mongols' capital. There was something like 100 players altogether. People were digging trenches, building fortifications, and it lasted days, much like a real siege. There were skirmishes here and there until finally the kingdoms broke through. Then the Mongols charged in with a unique, one-of-a-kind artifact called the Orb of Doom that they'd found. It killed the user and everyone around them instantly, and was ostensibly meant as a hee-hee-ha-ha from the developers, but ended up wiping out almost the entire siege party with only 2 activations and routed the rest. They were far from their kingdom, so they couldn't respawn anywhere near. This was the biggest, most concerted effort the game had ever seen, and it ended just like that. I remember the sheer anger in the Kingdom chat after that event. The Orb of Doom was nerfed heavily afterwards, but the damage was done. The height of PvP was over in one fell swoop. No one even wanted to fight the Mongols after that, and despite their victory, the whole Mongol Empire disbanded not soon after, not because they'd been beaten, but because apparently they'd irrevocably destroyed the morale of the entire server so hard it was practically an apology. That's just one example, but just look at how many random adjustments there are that only apply to PvP servers. Now imagine that every single one of these came as a reaction to some public outcry in a game where major engagements happened maybe once a month even at their peak. There's too many variables, it just takes too much time, and there's too much at stake to run enough trials to get anything even approaching balanced. When anyone joined the kingdom, they were basically hazed until it was proven that they weren't a spy for the enemy kingdom. There's that incredible beginner experience again. The developers had to add dedicated spy prevention where someone registered to the same IP couldn't be in 2 kingdoms at once, but obviously people got around that. It's compromise after compromise after compromise. I'm not saying that humans aren't fun to play against, I do it all the time, but think of all the games that are most popular for PvP. Things like shooters, fighting games, chess, all of these have limited scope in the locus of actual competition. Shoot your opponent first, you win, and if you lose, it's because your opponent shot better. The emergent complexity comes from aim, positioning, and awareness, but it's fairly straightforward to make it feel fair. Games like Dota or League of Legends are pushing the limits in my opinion, which is why they seem to spawn some of the biggest ragers in the world. But unlike Wurm Online, there are thousands upon thousands of matches being played every day. That plethora of data allows them to adjust the balance much easier. And they're still constantly doing it, and people are still constantly complaining. I don't need to argue this for Wurm Online, because this is all a posteriori. The game has already proven over nearly 20 years and multiple attempts that the majority of people do not like PvP compared to simply building in the safe servers. It's a similar situation to EVE Online, where it's much more interesting to read about the encounters than it is to actually play them. I've no doubt that there were several people who genuinely enjoyed Wurm PvP, but again, the results speak for themselves. I'm not saying it's impossible to make it work, I'm just saying a properly curated PvE experience will please a whole lot more people for a whole lot less effort. Anyway, my glorious dong is now scraping the sky. It took 2 hours to flat raise the slope to 170, but it was worth it. The passive-aggressive roommate actually showed up while we were building the guard tower, and despite my gracious offer to let him ring my bell, he simply calls us bots. It's funny because this is actually the one time building this place that I'm actually using real people to do my bidding, and that's rich coming from him considering he's got this Zoid character that's been in local this whole time locked in one of his houses. I examine him and it says he's only skin and bones. My god, man, feed your boy. I went exploring around his settlement and he literally had a sign out front telling you to go away, but all of this stuff is legitimately impressive, even if it's just him and his 3 alt accounts. Like, you can't even begin to imagine the amount of work that went into all of this. That Colossus alone takes like 2,000 bricks and clay. It makes me wonder why he wouldn't want people to look at it, but I suppose I've got to respect it. It's an artistic purity that others could only strive for. Apparently my snooping around caught his attention and he started trailing me. Then I found this troll pit and accidentally fell in because I wanted to see the slope and foolishly assumed that climbing would stop me from falling into it like it should. Again, this game is held together with spit and tape, and this happens because the mines are effectively a parallel dimension that has its own height map. As far as the game's concerned, no matter how high everything is, it's on the same two-dimensional grid, so if you try to break a wall between two squares with vastly different levels, all it does is connects the two, resulting in this beauty. It's so glitchy I can't even climb up by walking forwards. It's probably impossible to climb out without dropping all of my equipment. I complimented him on his pit and thanked him for the opportunity to grind my climbing skill, but he's still upset over the fact that I had the audacity to play the game as intended and lures a spider over the top of the pit to kill me. Again, as far as the game's concerned, there's only one tile separating us, even though it's like 200 feet above me. I could have killed it, but I didn't have any stamina after climbing. Thankfully, I can just respawn at my settlement token and run back over there. He calls me a griefer, which is a strange thing to say at the least, coming from the person who built an actual grief pit, and sadly my attempts to establish rapport go rebuffed. The other kind of troll pit is when you plant a ton of thorn bushes in a hole and make a tunnel at the bottom so people can't fill it with dirt. I fell in one of those when I first started playing the game and had to ask a GM to get me out, and it was like a god had descended. It was funny. Anyway, because I'm smart, I remember that after establishing my settlement, I've gotten a single free teleport instantly to the village. Usually it's intended to make recruiting noobs easier, but I can use this to grab all of my stuff and then zip back with /V teleport. I should mention that almost everyone in Wurm Online is really helpful, like this guy I started talking to about getting a horse. It figures I ended up settling next to the only neurotic on the server, but hey, it's free content. I would have been more than happy to tear down my whole base if he'd asked nicely, since this is just for a video, but now he gets to enjoy my massive dong in his backyard for the rest of time. I go out to fetch that horse I ordered, and the man was kind enough to sail from a completely different island to deliver it to me. For all its foibles, this is the part of the game that really feels one of a kind, and something I'd really love to see flourish in the future. The horse I bought is one that was specifically bred for speed, and it was equipped with 4 90 quality horseshoes, each blessed with Wind of Ages to make the horse go even faster. Sure, it cost me $15 worth of silver, but again, that's what patrons are for, and you can't argue with results. 38 kilometers per hour isn't bad. I bought this horse for a reason, but at this point I was winding down and happened to come across this person driving a wagon down the road, and I'm like, that's cool. At risk of adding myself to the list of grown men who dream of rebuilding the Roman Empire, is it weird that I look at logistical networks like this and think it's the coolest thing ever? Even back on the PvP servers, I thought that the cargo convoys filled with bricks to build guard towers were the peak of what Wurm could be. Anyway, that person is really nice and has apparently had their own run-ins with my neighbor. I follow her around and it turns out that she owns the settlement I passed by every time I had to get clay. Talking with her, apparently she's only been playing for a little over a year, so this game still does get newer players after all these years, and what they've built in that time is impressive. I asked her what she liked about Wurm Online, and she said the people and the relaxing vibe of it all. Unruly neighbors notwithstanding, I'm inclined to agree. With everything being player builds, the community that this kind of sandbox creates really is one of a kind. Eventually I've got to say my goodbyes because there's one final journey for me. I want to visit my old stomping grounds and see what's left of them, and it's a long journey, but that's why I bought this horse. I actually reached out to one of the original developers of Wurm Online, but he only got back to me after I'd already almost finished this video, so I'm shoving that here in post. I asked him what inspired them to make Wurm, and it's been 20 years, so understandably he couldn't remember the specifics, but he said that they were playing EVE Online together. It had released the same year as Wurm Online started development. That led to a because we got it in our heads that we could type endeavor, and the rest is history. Also, their company name, Mojang Specifications, was apparently their EVE company names made reality. The earliest occurrence of this sort of persistent online environment would be MUDs, or multi-user dungeons. When I asked if those were an inspiration, he said that while he hadn't played any of them, Rolf had played multiple, so I think it's safe to say yes. As for the fantasy and crafting elements of Wurm Online, the most seminal example would be the Ultima series. When I asked if the crafting system from Ultima had inspired Wurm in any way, he said, probably, and it's probably safe to assume that it also inspired his later work. I asked what he thought the most ambitious part was, and he answered the in-game economy. Wurm Online is an early example of games where the in-game currency was tied to real money and you could pay for premium purely through gameplay. He said it was specifically inspired by Entropia Universe, which was also a Swedish-made MMO from the early 2000s. There was also Second Life, but I'm not an MMO historian. I'll just say I thought it was cool being able to trade with other players to pay for premium, and it did a good job at making the silver feel truly valuable. I then asked him why it's called Wurm Online, and contrary to what it says if you Google it, Rolf didn't eat a worm. While he didn't remember specifically, he said that it's almost certainly from Magic the Gathering. I asked why it was programmed in Java, and even he didn't know anymore, probably just because it was what he used at work. On the technical side, he said that the terrain generation was the most difficult part, and that if he could use any knowledge he had today, it would have been shading and rendering techniques. He said that the terrain being simple height maps felt the most natural solution at the time, but admitted that the way that mines had to be implemented was very hacky, which fits my experience. When I brought up the topic of how everything in Wurm Online takes so much time, he said that making builds feel more impressive was one aspect, but also that MMOs at the time were also just notoriously grindy, so it's a bit of a generational thing. Though he mentioned that some of it may have also been Rolf's attempts to balance out the in-game economy, which is an angle I hadn't considered. He reminisced about the something awful goons constantly finding exploits they had to fix, but understandably after 20 years it's difficult to remember specifics. I wish I could have incorporated this into the video a little more elegantly, and maybe I should have thought up some better questions, but honestly, just confirming that Rolf played MUDs, Marcus loved Ultima 7, and that they both played EVE Online suddenly contextualized everything for me. But anyway. The feeling of riding past the ruins of old builds is an experience unlike anything I've ever experienced in another game. The closest analog I can think of would be traveling through the ancient servers on worlds.com, but Wurm has a different texture. It's the way that everything started out as nature, then slowly returns to it. It's that it's not quite dead, but certainly dying. The world is so big and the players so few, but they are out there. It makes the loneliness all the more poignant knowing that there's still some people huddled around the embers. It's an elegiac feeling. It's more than just the implacable march of time, it's that someone lived here, someone built here, and now they're no longer here. I can't help but imagine what it must have looked like when they built it, how much they enjoyed it, or the pride they would have taken in it, only to leave behind nothing but ghosts. Perhaps I'm being turgid, but it's difficult to enjoy the game when merely existing in its world fills me with a cosmic anxiety. I genuinely believe that the heart of Wurm Online is a beautiful thing, but it's surrounded by twisting, decrepit limbs. It's the poster child for technical debt. The only reason I didn't bring it up when I was talking about barotrauma is because I wanted to make this video. This game can be beautiful, when its graphics aren't glitching out. We're approaching the anomaly! I remember when they promised bridges, only for years to pass before they managed to implement them. Caves are parallel dimensions, and when I suddenly get kicked off my horse because of the code demons, it tells me I'm too far away to get back on even though I'm right next to it. Go into the cave, and sure enough, it lets me ride. With every Kickstarter scam promising this boundless player-driven sandbox experience, there's clearly a demand for this sort of thing, and Wurm Online has been the closest to the formula since 2006. It's actually bizarre to me that no one's attempted to evolve upon Wurm's example. I know MMOs are notoriously expensive, but Wurm started development in 2003 between two people, so you'd think that we'd have an even easier time 20 years later. I actually think the tile-based environment is an asset, because some people are way too ambitious, and that's how you end up feature creeping yourself over a cliff. Though the core idea has value, as it is, Wurm Online struggles to come together meaningfully. I've mentioned my opinions on the PvP, but it's a sandbox game that encourages building your own settlements, but settlements have next to no utility to the players whom aren't villagers. You can place player-owned merchants who can sell things, which is cool, granted, but that's about it. If you don't have money, player-owned settlements are completely pointless, and half of them are just locked off so you can't even look at them. There it is, my old guard tower. There's something beautiful about it, standing here for 10 years on the same plinth, watching over this area as everything molders away. There used to be a shanty town around here, but it's all returned to nature. Well, this was just a step along the way. I've got even further to go. Anyway, there needs to be a mechanically core purpose to settlements for both the villagers and the travelers. This would twofold encourage players to actually build big settlements, as well as make the travelers feel more in tune with the projects of their fellow players. How you present the possibilities is almost as important as the possibilities themselves. Spiritually, it would increase the sense of community, and would also stand out as an example of what's possible to the newer players, serving as a reminder of what all those resources they gather can be used for. Mechanically, each reasonably sized settlement would serve as de facto hubs. If you've made it this far, I've got to assume that you care about my opinions, so here's what I've envisaged for a Wurm-like suited to the modern age. It would be a strictly PvE affair. The main focus would be on building and logistics, where instead of building guard towers to expand your kingdom's borders, you would instead build things to expand into increasingly hostile wilderness. It would require concerted effort from the players, many consumable resources to claim it, and then many more to maintain it. Player-owned settlements would serve as logistical hubs, as well as centers for players to receive quests or fulfill orders that can be sent to the front line. The quality of resources would be dependent on where it was found in order to encourage exploration and the creation of specialized settlements to extract them so that things don't become a straight line. Ideally, everyone would find their preferred playstyle and filter into it naturally, so people who love building roads and expanding could work on the logistics, whereas the people who love combat could focus on clearing out the hostile flora and fauna. People who simply love building can make the settlements, and people who just want to gather resources and chill can serve as the backbone. Then you could have the explorers who search around for valuable nodes of resources. You could make it as complicated as real geological surveys if you really wanted. The sky's the limit. The point is, people who just want to build and hang out can do just that, but still feel like they're contributing, and each sort of macro role would support each other. The best stuff would be scavenged from the zone, but it would be important to ensure that any kind of expansion would rely on consumables so that there's always a demand for resource gatherers. Maybe if you didn't want all the expansion to be done by the power players, you could make some kind of affliction that stacks the longer you're inside the hostile areas, and only goes away over time in the less affected areas. But I'll think more about balancing the moment some studio offers me my rightful position as professional ideas guy. I'm not going to go on about this forever, but I genuinely think that the idea of an MMO sandbox like this would be, as the kids say, totally awesome sauce. I would say that this idea of mine was ambitious, if not for the proof of concept being right here in front of me. In my humble opinion, I look at most MMOs proposed these days and wonder what's even the point. To be reductive, they seem to play like cobbled together RPGs with an IRC channel attached, where most of the effort that otherwise would have gone into the story, characters, and gameplay had to instead be diverted into security to make sure that no one can invade your game and strip you naked. Things like Rust and Ark flirt with similar concepts, as do massive public Minecraft servers, but they can't quite reach the same effect as persistent and centralized servers. The experience of Wurm Online is truly like none other, and on that note, I think I've found it. Everything I've built is gone, and I'm not even sure this is the right place, but the mine looks familiar. Someone else has moved in, and they've put in a damned gate. One advantage to PvP servers, I could just bash this thing down and explore my rightful mine, but instead I go over here. There was more to this mine, I know it, and after digging through my ancient hard drive, I actually find it, the map that I used when I was prospecting for minerals. I mined down the walls, really regretting not buying a high-quality pickaxe while I was in the market, and I felt legitimately emotional when this wall fell down and revealed that little bit which still hadn't collapsed. I'm not even sure the mine's new owner knew that silver was in here. This lamp, man, this lamp is a trooper. It's planted, but I can pick it up, proving that it is indeed my lamp from so long ago. Fill it up, and it's back on. There's also gold in here somewhere, and there's another lamp. Man, the fact that I could experience something like this from a video game really is a testament to how unique Wurm Online really is. Well, there's not much left to do but to thank my patrons for funding these videos about relatively unknown and dying MMOs I played around 2007 and 2010. I remember coming back in 2014 to build this place and being like, woof, blast from the past. Unfortunately, my patrons don't number in the millions because otherwise I'd fund my dream MMO, and it would definitely be something like Wurm Online. This convoluted little game has informed many of my weird tastes for the years, and I'm glad I could share it, because there's definitely a lot more to it than a clumsy tutorial. Anyway, feel free to visit Bells and Outpost, visit the Dosh Holy Site, come ring our bell, located in scenic This Guy's backyard. You can't miss it. I'll probably hang around the area a little bit longer after uploading this video. Slap me in the face to get my attention. But anyway, that's about it. So, okay.